America first, protecting American jobs, fighting unfair trade practices. That's the pitch. Tariffs sound like the ultimate power move, taxing foreign goods, keeping jobs at home, and sticking it to the competition. But here's the thing. In most cases, they don't really work. Instead of helping, what's more likely to happen is prices will go up, jobs are lost, and the people who feel this burden the most are the middle and lower class. Now, according to the Peterson Institute of International Economics, which is a non-profit, private, non-partisan research organization that studies global economic issues, they have estimated that it will cost the average American household over $1,200 a year if Trump fully enacts these tariffs that he's mentioned. But let's set the table for a minute. On Friday, Donald Trump announced wide-sweeping tariffs on U.S. trade partners. Canada and Mexico were hit with 25% tariffs, and China was hit with a 10% tariff. It is important to clarify that the tariff on Canadian energy will be 10% and not 25%. But by Friday night, Canada retaliated with 25% tariffs on an assortment of U.S. goods. Mexico was anticipated to retaliate as well, potentially with 25% tariffs of their own. But by Monday morning, Trump and Mexico agreed to pause the tariffs for 1 month because Mexico agreed to send 10,000 troops to assist with securing the Mexican border. And China has filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization and said it will, quote, take corresponding countermeasures without really elaborating. By the time this video comes out, more will likely be revealed. But it's also important to note, in Donald Trump's executive action, it included a clause that allows the president to expand these tariffs if a country imposes new tariffs on the United States. So we could very well be in the early innings of a brewing trade war. So why is Trump doing this? And most importantly, what does it mean for consumers? Now, in order for Trump to enact these tariffs, he actually had to declare a national economic emergency, invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as the IEEPA, which authorizes the president to unilaterally manage imports during a national emergency. He needed to do this to enact these tariffs because without doing so, these kinds of changes would need to be made by Congress. So yes, this means the US is declaring an economic emergency. But why? Well, according to Donald Trump, quote, because of the major threat of illegal aliens and deadly drugs killing our citizens, including fentanyl. Now, the White House press secretary on Friday had claimed that fentanyl had killed, quote, tens of millions of Americans. Now, this is grossly over-exaggerated and flat-out misinformation, as you can see by these graphs here. And before people try to come after me and say that I'm downplaying how many may have died from this, no, I'm not. I don't think anyone is okay with the real number. But let's get the data correct, because the real number of overdose deaths of all synthetic opioids, which includes fentanyl, is nowhere near tens of millions of people. Now, this matters because misinformation like this can distort conversation on policy and public response. Okay, but back to the crux of the issue. I think a lot of Americans have been confused on this subject. They hear China will receive a 10% tariff on goods, and they think, good, make China pay for it, when in fact, that's not how it works. Let's take Nike, for example. They make a lot of their clothes and shoes over in China. So Nike orders a bunch of shoes, China makes them, they send them to the US, and when it arrives, Nike pays the tariff to the US government. Now, this will compress Nike's margin. And as a result, Nike will pass that cost increase back on to the consumer. Now, imagine this for a multitude of goods, because that is what's going to happen if these tariffs actually go through. So who really pays the price? Well, ultimately, you do, the consumer. Companies like Apple, Nike, Ford aren't just going to eat these costs out of the kindness of their hearts. They pass them on through higher prices, reduced product quality, or even layoffs to maintain their profit margin. And the kicker? Tariffs act like a hidden tax. Instead of the government directly raising taxes, they slap tariffs on imports, knowing full well that companies will raise prices on everyday Americans. But because it's not a tax you see on your paycheck, most people don't even realize they're paying it. But that's about to change, and now they actually might. With how much the cost of living has increased over the last 5 years, this is an indirect way to squeeze consumers while making it look like the government is punishing foreign countries. Now, to be fair, there is a rationale behind some tariffs, because some would argue that they protect domestic industries by making foreign goods more expensive. In theory, this would encourage people to buy American-made products, which would then boost local jobs and manufacturing, and in some cases, like China's dominance in electric vehicles, semiconductors, or steel production, The argument is that tariffs can level the playing field against unfair trade practices. The problem, though, is that most of the time, tariffs don't actually bring jobs back, at least not in the way politicians promise. US companies simply cannot compete with these countries, especially when they've already spent decades outsourcing production. And it's not just the cheap labor that makes manufacturing overseas more attractive. It's literally every aspect of the business. Cheaper labor plays a huge role. Wages in countries like China, Vietnam, and Mexico are a fraction of what they are in the US. Even if companies want to move production back, they'd have to pay significantly higher wages, making the products much more expensive. But also in some of these other countries, cheaper real estate plays a huge role. In many manufacturing hubs overseas, government provide tax incentives, cheap land, and fully built supply chain ecosystems that make production seamless. The US simply doesn't have these industrial clusters in the same way, meaning companies would need to build entire supply chains from scratch, an expensive and time-consuming process. Countries like China aren't just cheaper because of the labor, though. They're better at mass production. Decades of investment in factories, automation, and logistics have made their production lines incredibly efficient. Even if labor costs rose, their ability to scale production still makes them more cost-effective than any US factory could. There's also a lack of US manufacturing infrastructure, because many industries simply do not have the factories, machinery, or trained workforce in the US anymore. If Apple, for example, wanted to build iPhones in the US, they couldn't, because the highly specialized suppliers they rely on don't exist here. China has an entire city dedicated to electronic manufacturing, with component suppliers just miles from assembly plants. That kind of ecosystem doesn't exist in America. And also vitally important is fewer labor and environmental protections exist in other countries as well. These other countries allow for longer working hours, lower safety standards, and weaker environmental regulations, making it cheaper to produce goods. Companies don't have to deal with unions, strict OSHA regulations, or environmental impact studies like they would if they were in the US. So when tariffs hit, companies don't suddenly decide to bring jobs back to America. They just find another low-cost country like Vietnam, India, or Mexico and shift production there. And meanwhile, the industries that rely on imported materials like automakers, construction, and even small businesses end up paying more for goods, making them less competitive. But if you want to talk about small businesses for a moment, who do you think these increased costs will affect more? A small mom-and-pop shop or a conglomerate like Walmart? Not only do small businesses suffer more, their entire business could be on the verge of bankruptcy, because the bigger dog can simply deal with these cost increases at scale much better than they could ever. Walmart, along with other big companies, can and have front-loaded goods, meaning they preemptively bought huge amounts of goods to try to get ahead of these predicted tariffs. Other small companies simply could not do that. They had to wait and see if this was actually going to occur. But let's zoom out for a second. Here's the other side of the coin. Let's say after all of this you say, well, why is it good for America to rely on this cheap labor, like say in China, for all of these products that we consume? Won't these tariffs cause pain in the short term, but in hopes of America relying less on other countries in the long term? Now, whether one believes in this because of a national security threat that another country may pose, or they simply want American companies to be investing in workers here at home, in 2018, Donald Trump imposed a 25% tariff on imported steel to protect American steelworkers. While this policy led to a modest increase in employment within the steel industry, the broader economic consequences were significant. The tariffs caused domestic steel prices to rise, adversely affecting downstream industries that rely on steel as a primary input. Manufacturers, particularly in the automotive sector, faced higher production costs, which eroded their competitiveness. And some automakers responded by relocating production to countries like Mexico and Canada, where steel was more affordable, leading to job losses in the US manufacturing sector. So overall, the tariffs' negative impact on steel-consuming industries far outweighed the benefits to steel producers, resulting in a net loss of jobs and increased cost for consumers. And that's the irony of all of this. These tariffs will barely hurt the countries they're targeting and instead will hurt the people at home, particularly the working-class citizens. People love the idea that tariffs punish foreign competitors and bring back manufacturing jobs. But let's be real here. Corporations aren't moving production back to the US just because imports are a bit pricier. They're automating and offshoring to different countries or just raising their prices and calling it a day. Trade wars aren't won. They're just paid for by people like you and me. And like with any war, the so-called victor doesn't really win. They just get to pretend like they did. Now, earlier in the video, I mentioned that some companies may decide to cut back on the quality of their goods in an attempt to preserve their profit margins. And unfortunately, this practice has been increasing as of late. But recently, I did a deeper dive into this topic and looked at the inflation that consumers are not supposed to see. I covered it in this video here, so check it out next. Thanks for watching.